after considerable thought, and a good deal of soul searching, I reluctantly, of course, I knew it would be very good.
You can do a voice vote. You can just do a voice vote for this one. It's fine. Let's just take a vote just to be sure.
All in favor? All in favor? Aye.
Okay, so having already called the meeting to order in this odd order of disorder, we now need a roll call.
Mr. Ackerson,
Here.
Ms. Bynum, Mr. Fell,
Here.
Mr. Fitch, Mr. Hopkins,
Here.
Mr. Otto, Mr. Storr,
Here.
Mr. Trail,
Here.
and Mr. Turner.
Here.
Okay, so we have a quorum. Do we have any changes to the agenda? All right, we have two sets of minutes to approve, one from the joint meeting on the bicycle plan and one from our December 10 meeting. Any comments, questions on the minutes, draft minutes? Yes, Barry.
Minor, very minor, was it the minutes? Yes. Minutes, page 7, because I always look for things that have my name attached to them. There's one not too many in that paragraph. So this is because they want to remove the existing partial sidewalk, that not should be struck. It just reads, because they want to remove the sidewalk because it is not really used and does not fit. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Got that?
Yes, on page 7, 1, 2, 3, about 4 or 5 paragraphs down, paragraph starts with Mr. Ackerson on the second line, where it says because they want to remove the existing partial sidewalk, the first not should not be there. There's 2 other knots after that are fine.
It's a naughty question.
I don't want
we've got
to
here.
do a triple negative.
Okay, any other comments, questions on the minutes? Can I get a motion to approve maybe both of them on the same motion and
Sure. I so move.
second? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, communications. I don't think we have any. Continued public hearings, we have none. Old business, we have none. New public hearings. So I'm going to open the public hearing on Plan Case 2269T16. I am not going to read our instructions because I don't see an audience to listen to them. And I think we know how we proceed.
All right. Since this is a new mic, please help me out with volume if you need more or less. I haven't used it yet, so thank you. All right. So yes, we are here to discuss a text amendment to allow transitional homes within the city of Urbana. In November, City Council passed a motion to direct the zoning administrator to present a text amendment and also to come up with regulations for transitional homes. So what I'm going to do today is discuss, of course, what we mean by transitional homes, provide a little context in terms of what we already have in our zoning ordinance that is somewhat related, how we've treated them in the past, and then I'll get into the specifics. So a transitional home, generally speaking, is one which helps fill the gap between emergency housing and permanent housing. So it's intended for homeless individuals. Usually the stays are between 6 months and 2 years. Services are provided. Oftentimes someone is a live-in staff member. Basically, those services help to get those individuals back ready to have that permanent housing. So those services could range from financing, budgeting, some, how do you sign a lease, that kind of thing. Really, it runs the gamut depending on the need. What we've done before, because we do have transitional housing within the city, is that we have called it a home for adjustment. Now, that definition, I'll just scroll up here a little bit. I'm not going to read it necessarily, but in essence, it allows things like rehabilitation centers, crisis centers, and emergency shelters. So it is pretty broad, home for adjustment. So we have in the past permitted transitional homes to come in under this definition. But what this does is it really limits where a transitional home can be located. Home for adjustment, just to scroll down, is typically permitted in some of the higher intensity, higher density residential zones and most of the business zones. A few other of the zones requires a special use permit to have that home for adjustment. And a transitional home is a bit different. I'll get into what we're proposing in a moment, but often they are smaller, more family-oriented, meaning it's communal, so you don't have a large shelter as would be allowed in a home for adjustment. Another use that is often grouped in together is a community living facility. And that one is really specific because state law actually defines as they say, service-dependent, oh, there's a typo, I apologize, service-dependent population. What that means is individuals that have either mental or physical disabilities and who require supervision. So in order for us to consider a building to be a community living facility, it needs to meet that strict definition. So your typical transitional home where individuals don't have mental or physical disabilities or don't require supervision wouldn't fit under that definition. So City Council has asked us to consider something else to allow transitional homes, particularly those that are smaller and would be appropriate for the lower density residential areas. So that's what we undertook once we were given that direction in November. We looked at a variety of ways to go about this. A lot of different communities treat things differently. So in our search, and through information provided by the American Planning Association, we found there isn't, one answer out there, of course. There rarely is. The APA did indicate that if there is a trend, it's trending toward allowing them more so as a matter of right rather than requiring special use permits or other zoning approvals. They also indicated that while some communities do place distance restrictions from one facility to another, that doesn't really help at all with the efficiency of the service delivery. So they didn't come out with a position necessarily, but they were suggesting that distance requirements aren't always the right answer because that isn't going to get you the end result of having efficient services for those folks that need them the most. So we also looked at the California state law, which was something that I found to be the most progressive, in that basically it treats them just like any other residential use. So if you can build a house that has 5 unrelated people in this zone, then you can have a transitional home with 5 unrelated people in that same zone. So they treat it the same as any other residential use. We also, as I mentioned, looked at our own zoning ordinance. We looked at those different categories of uses that I described, the community living facilities and the home for adjustment, and tried to develop a mechanism that was similar in some ways to community living facilities, because that definition really breaks that up into 3 different categories based on how many people are living there. So community living facility category 1, for instance, allows 4 residents and 2 live-in staff. So we thought that might be a good mechanism. What we also needed to decide was where we would recommend these be allowed, either as permitted uses, as special uses, which require a public hearing in front of Plan Commission and then final consideration by City Council, or conditional uses, which are considered by the Zoning Board of Appeals, and they're the determining body there. It does not go further. So conditional use has 1 public hearing, special use has a public hearing and City Council consideration versus permitted use, which is administratively approved. So I just want to take a moment to, and I can't fit this whole table on here, but I think you'll start to get the idea, and nothing is allowed in industrial where this falls off the page. So we did a comparison in this table looking at home for adjustment, where it's permitted, where it's a special use, community living facility category 1, which is the smaller ones, Category 2, which is up to 8 residents plus 2 staff. And, excuse me, then provided a few suggestions on where transitional homes might want to go with the same types of number or, resident limitations. So, in essence, home for adjustment, as I mentioned, is generally permitted in the higher intensity zones, whereas community living facility is permitted nearly across the board. The only exceptions there are some of the business zones and the lower business zone, the neighborhood business conditional use permit. But again, that is for a very particular population, and it's a protected class population. So we didn't feel that it was necessarily appropriate to allow even the small transitional homes at the same level as community living facilities. So we scaled that back a little bit without going as far as a home for adjustment, because our charge, of course, was to look at transitional homes in the lower density residential. So what that gives us then is a couple of definitions to look at. The first one is for that first category, which is the smallest one. Here we're suggesting that the category 1 would allow a maximum of 4 homeless individuals plus a maximum of 1 resident live-in staff at any time. And we wanted to include in there that it would exclude emergency shelter because that is addressed by another use category. Category 2, transitional home category 2, we're suggesting would allow a maximum of 8 homeless individuals plus a maximum of 2 live-in staff. That is identical to the category 2 for community living facilities. We're suggesting that it is a permitted use in R4 and above residential zones, and in all of the business zones B2 and above. And the smaller ones would be a conditional use in R2, R3, R7, B1, and MOR. And the category 2, which is up to 8 homeless individuals plus 2 live-in staff, so up to 10 people. A special use, so kicking that up a little bit because the size is increased to special use in R2 and R3, scaling that back a little bit for conditional use in R4, and then permitted use, just like home for adjustment, in the higher density residential, and a permitted use in most of the business districts with a special use in B1 neighborhood, business, and MOR. So additionally, we had to look at the parking requirement, of course. We chose to look at community living facility and home for adjustment. That parking ratio we thought was reasonable for transitional homes. So that ratio is 1 space for every 4 residents, or excuse me, 1 space for every 4 residents and 1 space for every employee that's on a maximum shift. So we thought that that made sense to use the same parking requirement as the other similar uses that we already have in the zoning ordinance. We did look at the comprehensive plan, and of course there is goal 39 about improving the quality of life for all residents, and that is broken down into a few different objectives, 2 of which of course address homelessness and affordable housing. So we thought that this would help contribute to meeting those goals and objectives. Just in summary, we are suggesting a text amendment to the zoning ordinance to allow dwelling, transitional homes, 2 different categories, 1 small, 1 large, those to be in different zoning districts, of course, yet to have a parking requirement of 1, as I mentioned earlier. We were directed to present something, a text amendment of some sort, to you, and then ultimately to City Council. So what we are suggesting is that you have a few options: either forward the case to City Council with a recommendation for approval, forward the case with a recommendation for approval as modified if you have some specific changes, or forward the case to City Council with a recommendation for denial. Seeing as this is coming from staff, we're of course recommending that you would recommend approval, but I would be certainly happy to talk about any of the specifics and answer any questions.
Could you explain a little bit more why you thought it was wise to go more restrictive for the transitional home category 1 than community living facility 1 in R2, R3, and R7?
Let me just have that table handy so that we can. In essence, community living facility is a very specific definition. It's, and I'm guessing that you have a lot of information on this, perhaps more so than I, so I would welcome your input. But it is state-driven, this definition on who the population that it serves, whereas we don't necessarily have that constraint for transitional homes.
So you're saying there's a, I don't want to say more stringent, but a more clear definition of the population to be served in those homes.
That's correct.
Whereas
Or
that could
community
be-
living facility, yes.
Right. That was the only thing that really I was wrestling with, is the idea of it being more restrictive. But I do understand that there is a clear definition by state mandate for the community living, so. That's all.
Thank you. Lori, are there any examples that, in the local area that you could point to for some of these different types of facilities, please?
Well, most of the ones that I know about are associated with a shelter, so they fell under the category of home for adjustment originally. I will say that there is an example in Champaign that is truly just transitional, as far as I know, and it's for women that are pregnant. They come there when they're pregnant, and then they can stay for a while after they have the baby until they're back on their feet, and they can move into more permanent housing. That's north near Marketplace Mall, and in fact was the reason why Champaign changed their own rules on this very issue a few years ago, and was in order to allow that use to be there.
Is there what is the facility that's at Vine and Washington that's kind of, I think may have been supported by Kendall Gill? It's on the northwest corner across from the high school, or the middle school.
I'm not familiar with that one. Does anyone have any input?
I think I know. It's for students from Cunningham Children's Home. It's sort of a transitional housing facility, so they don't live at Cunningham, they live in that house.
Oh, okay. Where would that fall into one of these categories?
We can ask staff.
We can look at the zoning of that. It's potential that it would be permitted as a home for adjustment in that zone as a matter of right. I mean, if it's a, I mean, I would have to look at the specifics of that case. I don't know where it, under what circumstance it came in. Perhaps it's affiliated with a religious institution, which often has a little more leniency. I'm not. Yeah. But there are others. Excuse me. Right, so I would need to look into the background of that. One example is a men's shelter on Main Street, which is zoned R4, if I remember correctly, and is also potentially associated with a church. So, as I said, if once you get an association with the church, oftentimes there's a little more leniency on the kinds of uses you can do because it is accessory to that use. So, I'm not sure about that other example, but we can look into it for. Right. Or could have been there forever, I don't.
Forever is not that long from but then, I've been around forever. So, other questions?
I'm having a little trouble with when something becomes a facility. I think, we sort of bounce back around to facility. If I have a large home
Mhm.
and I have some empty bedrooms, and I invite a family to live in my home for a period of time while they get on their feet, maybe they were or were not officially homeless before, whatever, am I running a transitional home?
Well, the issue comes down to a different regulation in city code about how many unrelated individuals can live in a dwelling unit, and that number is 4. So what we're proposing here is that, yes, if it's 4 unrelated individuals, you can do that anywhere, that's allowed. But with transitional homes, often they have that live-in staff member, so that's a 5th person, and therefore it would not technically meet the city code for allowing beyond 4 unrelated individuals to live there.
Well, let's say we have 4 unrelated individuals. I've always had problems with these kinds of things, honestly, anyway. What would restrict that from happening in R1?
Nothing.
So.
I mean, technically, really, I mean,
Until you hit 5, almost regardless of the nature of the relationship or the purpose or the whatever, right? Then there's notice. So this is basically to allow some specific purpose that we're going to call a transitional home. We keep mentioning homeless, to have more than 4 unrelated individuals. Unrelated individuals meaning they have to be from 4 different families, however that's, if I invited a family into my home, I would be unrelated to them, but they'd all be related to each other?
Correct,
Is that 4
yes.
unrelated individuals?
based on what you've told me, it sounds like that would be permitted. Because they are related, and you are not. So, really what this is to get at the small institutions that really want, and I shouldn't call them institutions, I apologize, those small homes to fit into different neighborhoods, because that's where there are houses available to purchase and to run these organizations.
And I'm trying to get at, well, what is, I think there's something here, because we keep saying facility. That's the,
Well,
Is it-
community living
is it the f-
facility is a definition that we have in the zoning ordinance. What we're suggesting today does not include the term facility. I
right, but
misspoke a
we
moment
keep
ago.
saying facility. I'm just trying to get at, what this is and why. I mean, what's the,
Well, the request from council did follow a couple of months after a request that was heard here to rezone a parcel on North Matthews from R2 to R4, and then as a follow-up to approve a special use permit to operate a home for adjustment, because at the time we didn't have a transitional home, and we don't today, a transitional home definition or a zoning ordinance. If this were to be approved, that kind of use then could come in potentially as a special use permit without requiring that rezoning.
is there a city or state or anything licensed that has to be obtained to run as opposed to just inviting some people into your home out of the goodness of your heart or through your church or whatever?
I think there are various levels, and I'm not sure if Mr. Ackerson could help me out on some of the details, since this is his background.
Unfortunately, I'm a lot more familiar with the laws in the state of Alabama on this than I am the law in the state of Illinois, because I used to work in the area. You're bringing up people bringing in unrelated people in their homes, and you're really talking about something that's done through an agency or a church or some kind of nonprofit, basically. And so you're trying to come up with some codification that someone who has or wants to start up such an enterprise would want to be able to engage in. So it's really not, these kinds of regulations are not oriented toward the individual homeowner who wants to have, sponsor some people for a number of days. There is, I think, some concern about, could we unintendedly, create something else that we're not aware of. But the reason I ask about the more restrictiveness for the transitional home versus community living facility is I'm on the side of the fence that the folks in California are. I think we should treat more of these kinds of places with the assumption that as long as there aren't bad things going on, as residential to some extent. From what I understand, though, there are concerns when you're just saying homeless. There's no control over the population that might come into there. And so that's what I'm understanding from the city. What I forgot I wanted to ask you was, you already answered one of it, part of it, which was, did this originate from some nonprofit request? And the other is, have you guys consulted with any nonprofit or social service agencies in the community about what you proposed here?
Yes, and so we have a grants division within our department, and they often meet with service providers that run these very organizations. We did provide the draft language to them. They reviewed it, had a couple of questions. I answered those questions, and I didn't hear any response back that was negative. So I'm not going to say that we blanketed the community with it, but we at least did consult with both our staff, which have some familiarity, as well as with that larger community group.
Okay.
I kind of, I guess part of some of the gist of why I asked it the way I did was the homeless thing is I used to live on the East Coast during periods of time when there were substantial refugee resettlement networks. People, invited refugee families into their homes, often not with any official sanction or whatever, sometimes through church networks and the other. And I remember one of the things that some jurisdictions were trying to say, well, you're running a homeless facility. Because obviously they don't have a home yet, they're refugees. I tend to think it's like, as long as you fall within the occupancy, then, there isn't an issue. But now you're saying basically this is to allow certain kinds of facility, which I assume basically you're saying, I don't know, the homeless thing, that they're not providing specific on-site services, simply a residence.
There are usually some services provided. Like I said, it runs the gamut. I think the idea here is to open it up a little bit more to allow buildings that are sized appropriately for the community in which they would be.
So why exclude R1 then?
I mean, we could certainly talk about that. We started there because we thought it was a good sort of in between the community living facility model and the home for adjustment. What we're suggesting sort of splits that difference.
Because at least my experience was that was often one of the most, the things that they were looking for if you were wanting, either people who their family moved out, they still had a large house, et cetera. But those were almost always in single-family residential areas. I mean, most of the ones I'm familiar with from back in the day, back then, were all in single-family residential areas. And in fact, that's at the time where they preferred, because you're transitioning them to, the idea is to make it as much as possible like they're just living in a regular neighborhood.
I suppose one thing to think about is that not all, but a lot of our R1 residential is out on the more the periphery of the community, and it would be more difficult to reach the services that are generally more internal. So that is a consideration, but certainly you can suggest something other than what we've suggested today.
Well, and that's kind of, I think, where the homeless, there are other reasons to have transitional, living arrangements, some of which are not necessarily around the idea of, the services that might be required by someone who was involuntarily homeless prior.
So I think there's maybe a difference in what I sense the council is after and the kind of instance you're describing, which is I see this as an organization buying a property and setting it up for this purpose, not a home in which a resident lives and invites somebody
And I
to
agree.
live with them.
And I think maybe it would be better if it was a little more explicit about that in some way. I mean, I don't know.
Could I ask,
Okay.
so David, your concern is though that with the housing stock, you're right, what we want to do is normalize housing as much as possible for a lot of these people. Which was my question. I didn't think so much about R1, but the others was why make a difference between community living facility and transitional home. So splitting the difference was kind of what they came up with, I think. That I'm still trying to decide if that's, but is that what you're getting at, is why not make it more like the community living facility regulations?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think of community living facilities as one, I mean, it's laid out in state. I'm sure there must be state licensing or regulations that they have to follow. And they're permitted to perform certain kinds of services in an organized fashion that you might not have, counseling and other sorts of things. This seems more aimed at the idea of basically they're providing a residence. I mean, and it's I guess it's the homelessness piece because there are other reasons why. I mean, I just think of what you were talking about, the women who are going to have
Pregnant women.
might not have been because they were homeless. They were just, needing some kind of transitional residential situation. They might not have even been in need of any kind of significant services or anything other than sort of individualized things. So I'm not thinking this is bad. I'm just not sure. Like, for instance, the question, why not an R1? To me, that's where you're mostly going to find, I think, the kinds of pre-existing buildings that are, key to this kind of thing as families get smaller and all that sorts of things. So I'm not against it. I'm just not sure it's exactly how I would have written, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong.
So it seems to me one of the differences is we presume in this case that there are staff. And in a single-family neighborhood, the notion of a facility that has to sort of push the terminology and get a different perspective, transients, that is a rotating population that is on purpose rotating and being managed as rotational with a staff and owned by an organization, not a resident, is different from the logic of a residence. Now, what the distinctions are between R1 and R2 actually have to do with all sorts of things, not just the idea that it's single family, since most of our single family neighborhoods are actually zoned R2 or R3. At least speaking as an R2er myself. So I think there's what we're trying to define is something that's at least not the straight residential, because we're not assuming that it's somebody's house. It's not where somebody lives and does
So
rents out rooms.
we're
or-
assuming we're going from residence to facility.
Well, I don't know what you mean by facility, or what you mean by
n-
resident, but,
if not-
but
if-
the occupants of this place are not going to be the owners of this place, and they are not going to have signed a long-term lease with this place. And the owner is likely to be an organization, not a landlord that is trying to find the most reliable, long-term tenants that they can find. So it's not even quite like a duplex. So if that's the connotation of facility, then yeah, I think that's the difference. It is a facility.
David, am I understand, and I don't know if, should I just be addressing questions, or are we just back and forth allowed at this point in the?
Well, I think it's working, and if it
Okay,
stops
okay.
working, I'll intervene.
Well, I think one of the questions is what housing stock is available to people who want to do this kind of an operation. Is that what you're trying to get at? That I mean, one is treating people fairly, and another part is what housing stock's available to them. And I think what you were saying is there's plenty of R2, R3, and so forth available closer to the city core where there may be services available rather than R1, which would sway me a little bit more towards it, I guess.
And the price point might also
And the
play.
price point might be different. But you are talking about people buying, often they are looking at buying existing housing that people have lived in as single-family residences. But the difference being that the owners will now be some nonprofit or faith-based group or something like that. One of the things I wondered about too, that I will address, since it's consistent with community living, I guess I can live with it, but really 3 or 4 parking places for one house? So you got, well, it's consistent with community living, so I guess I don't have an argument with it, but I'm
And a
not-
single-family house does have a 2 parking space
Right.
requirement, just for
Right.
context.
Right. So I was thinking 2 or 3 might suffice, but I can't really argue if it's consistent with community living facilities, so
Well, you can certainly argue, I mean, it's.
I'm just not sure if it's needed, but I'm just thinking on the other side of, gosh, how much parking do we need in the city?
I just realized I misspoke. I'm an R3er. I keep forgetting. But I think one of the things to keep in mind is in this city, R1 has actually been used as a specific tool, dare I be quite so blunt, to protect the State Streets area from encroachment by students. And if you look at the zoning map, the amount of R1 is minimal. There are a couple of pockets, I mean, maybe half a dozen pockets. The rest is R2 or R3. So I think we could argue about the zoning map on a different context, but I don't think in terms of restricting the number of possible locations.
What's the nature of the housing in those areas?
In what areas?
Where the R1s.
R1s.
It is not dissimilar from housing in other areas, except that there's no tactful way to put it, really. In order to keep students out of certain neighborhoods are more restrictively zoned than others.
Right, but what makes them attractive to students?
It's just close to the university.
And they're older neighborhoods with larger houses.
In some cases, yes,
Yeah,
but not in all cases, actually.
yeah, but that's often the,
Yeah,
because, so that's kind of where
but I guess what I'm trying to say is, that's a whole different question. If it's a whole different question. In this city, it's a whole, that's why I'm saying there's no tactful way to put it. This has been a battle of 40 to 50 years.
all of these things are bad. But I guess
No.
partially, along this line of the issue, part of what I'm trying to get at is that those might be exactly the same areas that would have the kind of existing housing stock that might be the most appropriate for this kind of facility, at least in areas that I've lived in the past.
Yeah.
You often-
R2, there's
it's-
so little R1 that it's hard to argue about. That's my point. I don't want to argue about the exact details, but this little bit, which is Florida to Michigan and Lincoln to state, to race, is R1. All of the rest of this is R2. All of this is R3. So there are plenty of 4-bedroom houses all over the city, and I'm not even looking at north. I mean, north, there's no R1 at all.
I understand
Let's
that,
get
but
outside
what's
city.
the rationale for excluding if it's fine for R2 and it's fine for R3, and you're saying right now the housing stock is substantially similar, why exclude R1?
Because the logic of what R1 has been created for is to be more exclusive of certain kinds of invasions. And I
under-
don't think we want to take that up
Right.
on this
I-
context.
Right, I
We
understand.
might want to take it up, but not
I-
on this context.
And I understand that argument, and I would not want to do anything that, let's just be frank, I don't want to do anything that would sink this proposal when it goes to city council. If there's pushback, I would not want to do that. But R1 is allowed for community living facility category 1.
I should also, and I apologize, I didn't point out that for community living facilities, there is a separation distance.
Oh, yeah.
You can have
That's right.
one, but then if you want to put another one between 1,000 or 1,500 feet, depending on what the zoning district is, then you would need to seek a special use permit.
Right.
And there is at least one community living facility, I'm pretty sure, in the area I just described as R1,
I think that's
which
right.
probably serves to prevent any more.
Although that's from one another, that isn't necessarily from other uses. So,
No, I understand, but being one and the small area that is involved, no, actually, the area is big enough that there could be another one, I think, because this one's right at the corner. Okay, are we ready to vote on this? Or are there more questions or discussion? Okay, let's have a roll call. Oh, we need a motion. Details. We need a motion. Can we get a motion?
I move that we send Plan Case 2269T16 to City Council with recommendation of approval.
Second? Second? Okay, now we can get a roll call.
Mr. Fell,
Yes.
Mr. Hopkins,
Yes.
Mr. Storr,
Yes.
Mr. Trail,
Having been a problem, I'm still gonna, I'm actually gonna vote yes.
Mr. Turner,
Yes.
Mr. Ackerson.
Yes, 'cause my comments are already in the minutes.
Okay, that passes. And that'll go to council.
February 1st.
Okay. So now we have Plan Case 2270T16. We'll open the public hearing. I will again not describe the procedures because our vast television audience doesn't get to participate.
So this is Plan Case 2270T16, an amendment to Article 2, Article 5, and Article 9 of the zoning ordinance to change definitions, use provisions, and regulations of home occupations. The City Council passed ordinances in the 90s that regulated home occupation. That meant working from someone's home or out of someone's home or having a small home-based business to obviously accommodate it within primarily residential uses. It exists as an accessory use to a residential property. In recent years, obviously there have been many changes in technology, the way that people work, the way that people live, that have necessitated perhaps expanding, adjusting, changing the existing language in the zoning ordinance that relates to home occupations. There have been minor adjustments in recent years. Most recently, this past spring, there were slight changes made, but based on staff observations as well as a request from the Urbana City Council that the city make accommodations and changes to how we regulate home occupations, such as the reason why we are proposing this text amendment. Currently, in the zoning ordinance, a home occupation under section 512, or in Article 2 it's defined. In section 512, it's stated into pretty much two sorts of categories. It requires approval by the zoning administrator for either category, but the first category basically allows someone to work out of their dwelling. It identifies the small amount of signage they might have and has some rules relating to equipment, storage, commercial vehicles that might be used in association with that business as well. It's confined to only people who live there, and that does not require a certificate of occupancy. The zoning ordinance also has a second category, which anything that exceeds the criteria in the first category, and the exceeding of those criteria are mainly based on people who work for the home occupation that do not reside in the household, and for customer visits and or parking needs. And that is a home occupation that requires the issuance of a certificate of occupancy and has certain limitations, such as where material and equipment might be stored. The same requirements for signage and for the nameplate. It also has a limit of one person who does not reside in the household of working for that home-based occupation, and it also has a limit of 2 customer or clients on the premise at any one time. And it also states a few other limitations based on landscaping or based on home occupations involving vehicle repair as well. So in looking at how the zoning ordinance is framed, or how this language is framed for home occupations, we decided to consult with business owners who worked exactly out of their homes within the city, some of whom are involved in the Urbana Business Association, some of whom are very prominently known within the city, some of whom are more innocuous. They were referred to us by some of their friends or their families, but they're not as they're not as well known. It's very it's not so easily noticeable that they are working out of their home. But after consultation with those individuals, some involved jobs that were involved telecommuting, some involved the manufacture of goods and products or artisanal products, and some involved customer and consumer-based retail. After consulting with that, as well as observing what few other cities and towns did in Illinois that were comparable to Urbana. Urbana's in a unique situation of being near a major university where there's lots of young talent and entrepreneurial talent that might want to stay in the area, but also establish their own place of work. We also decided to look at our existing ordinance, not to reinvent the wheel, but to bend it just a little bit, not break it, but bend our regulations so that we could accommodate a greater range of uses, or have a wider access. That's what's allowed in the zoning ordinance as opposed to what exists now. But at the same time, use existing resources, nothing that would incur greater expenses on enforcing of the zoning ordinance or of city policy. But at the same time, allowing the zoning ordinance to still do its job, which is to enact proper zoning and land uses in the areas designated through the city. Just want to point out, if you didn't hear me before the start of the meeting, that the handout that I passed out is just some minor changes to the text amendment that was included in, or that wasn't included in the packet. It's just a version that's somewhat easier to read. It was formatted a little better, and it includes language in Article 9 on the signage that's only to make it consistent with language that we'd already proposed about signage in Article 5. The substance of the text amendment is the exact same. I'll just go to that. So in the proposed changes to the text amendment, one change that we're doing throughout the text amendment is we're removing the immediate family aspect and just change of people residing on the premise and changing that to household, because the family is not the overwhelming majority of households in the city. So that might involve roommates or people living together. It might involve any sort of combination of people, as long as people who are residing in the household. That's the only criteria that matters. Then we are defining those two existing categories of home occupation that I described that exist. We're labeling it Type A and home occupation Type A, home occupation Type B. We also are creating a new occupation of Type C. These categories will be defined by their level of intensity, of the level of use intensity. So those are added to Section 2.3 definitions. Throughout each of these categories, along with some of the existing criteria, there's some more descriptive language that's added for each category to provide better understanding. Category A remains largely the same. It does not require a certificate of occupancy or a conditional use permit. It includes some better description, some examples such as private consulting, non-retail based arts and crafts, internet-based business, etc. It still limits the people who are involved in the occupation to just people who reside in the household. There's a slight allowance in the increase in the amount of signage from 1 square foot to 3 square feet. This allows a little more visibility from the street without being obnoxious or that more inconvenience to the neighborhood, but just allows a little more identifiable traits for the house beyond something larger than just the address plate on the household. There is some rearrangement of wording and language from existing rules for exterior visibility as well. We also expanded on the definition of outside storage material being visible, and we just define that as visible from a public right-of-way. Otherwise, most of the language is the same for parking in terms of the criteria that says no more than 2 commercial or business vehicles. We added trucks or trailers because we expand upon vehicle storage in other parts of the ordinance and where they might be stored. We thought it would be prudent to add this sort of language as well. If anyone basically has a home-based occupation, they want to employ someone who does not reside in their household, or they have a level of customer traffic that exceeds of any sort, we go to the category Type B, which is defined as exceeds Type A, involves a minor amount of traffic from individuals not residing in the household. The examples include music lessons, professional consultations, personal services like clothing alterations, tailor or shoe cobbler, etc. Like before, it requires approval by the zoning administrator and issuing of a certificate of occupancy. Changes that we proposed is not a limitation of 1 person that does not reside in the household, but 2 people who no longer reside in the household, or who don't reside in the household to be employed. We thought that was a little more flexibility offered to someone, because if you have 1 person, the odds are your business might be going to the fact where you want to accommodate 2. We also added, the biggest change in this was we defined customer-client visits. No more than 10 visits per day from customers, clients, or home deliveries are included in this category as well. That's consistent with the amount of visits that might be arrived at daycare homes, which is something that's already defined in the zoning ordinance. Only reason that we mention language is there in that criteria is to distinguish that and show that, because sometimes they receive state inspections, or just because we want that's a special consideration of home occupation that really is not being changed with this text amendment. And then the other major accommodation we made was vehicular parking. And with the way that different neighborhoods are in the city, the needs of parking needs in one neighborhood might be a lot different than the needs of another neighborhood. So we decided to offer flexibility in the sense that previously, in existing code, there's the requirement, not an option, but the requirement of 2 off-street parking spaces that can be satisfied by the driveway, but nevertheless 2 off-street parking spaces for any home occupation that needs to be issued a certificate of occupancy in the Type B. With the proposed changes to Type B, we are allowing that to be waived or reduced based with approval from the zoning administrator based on demand generated by the use or the location of the home occupation, as well as the on-street parking supply. Again, we are making the change of 3 square feet as opposed to 1 square foot. There's still existing language defining, for not allowing anything that constitutes, that violates nuisance code. More changes, changing from immediate family just to the household. And also a criteria that says the zoning administrator shall identify and impose other conditions on the home occupation as determined by the specifics of the application in order to meet the intentions of the ordinance and to protect the health, safety, and general welfare of the city of Urbana. So that would be a more moderate intensity of use for a home-based occupation. Those 2 categories would probably cover the majority of home occupations that the city would see or accommodate. Because there are some examples, though, of home occupation that we thought would be appropriate for a 3rd category that we call Type C. These would be ones that have a use impact that is greater than that of a traditional residential household. That would involve more customer-client traffic or a greater amount of inventory or activity on the site that would exceed the normal expectations of what would happen in a residential neighborhood. Some of these services might include assembly or packaging for internet sales, on-site sales of goods and services, a site that grows greenhouse or with a greenhouse or plant sales, bicycle repairs or sales, minor auto repairs, group-based classes or instruction, etc. These categories would be required to, this category would be required to apply for a conditional use permit, where it would be, it would receive a hearing before the Urbana Zoning Board of Appeals, where it would have to meet the criteria set forth in Section 7.2 of the zoning ordinance to state that the use is appropriate for the property located. It also provides a public hearing and the chance for people in the neighborhood who are nearby, because our ordinance requires people receive notification if there's a conditional use permit application. It provides them a chance to state their support or opposition to any application in a neighborhood. There's also just a stating of certain home occupations which might be considered hazardous or nuisance. There are a lot of occupations that are still subject to building safety codes. For example, someone performing auto repairs in their home would not be allowed to do things like oil changes because there are state and local standards for performing such an act on commercial properties, let alone residential properties. We just insert a statement saying that only minor automobile repairs are allowed or are permitted in that state. And the last major change that we're proposing, the existing code allows for only one home occupation to exist in a household. We decided to change this as long as it doesn't exceed the provisions set forth in a type B home occupation. So that way that husband and wife might each have different jobs. They both might work out of their homes, but they would both be allowed to do that. But under existing code, they wouldn't. So we thought that was, as long as it matches the criteria in type A or type B, as long as it's innocuous like that, you can have 2, 3, or 4. Someone also might have 2 different gigs. You can probably envision the scenarios that necessitate that. Lastly, in Article 9, there are just some minor changes to be consistent with changes we proposed in Section 5, changed immediate family just to household, and the change in the size of square footage of the nameplate on the house from 1 square foot to 3 square feet. So with that language, the staff recommendation is for approval of the proposed text amendment. You may forward this to the council with a recommendation of approval, or make a recommendation to be changed, so forth, or you may deny it. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Just one, and mostly because we just had the other hearing before this one. There's this, for the new category, there's no restriction on what zoning they could be located in?
Well, this would be for any zoning that allows residential use.
So you could have this much traffic in an R1 neighborhood?
Yes, assuming the ZBA determines it's appropriate and approve. It still receives.
Still has to have the hearing?
Yeah.
First is a question, is a conditional use permit permanent, or does it?
It follows the use, I think, and the applicant.
Okay. So what I'm sort of driving at, and I'm not sure it's a problem, but in type C, theoretically, 4 students could live there and say we need 3 more employees. So they get that many students, and what prevents everybody who lives there from moving out and making it a widget manufacturing facility?
I'm not sure I follow.
Well, they're residents when they start it, but now they have this home occupation C. Theoretically, all the residents could move out and only use it as a manufacturing plant, per se.
That's possible. They're still limited by not violating nuisance code. There are also limitations there are additional conditions that can be imposed by the zoning administrator for a conditional use permit, or by the ZBA that approves that permit to enact safeguards from something like that happening.
Do I miss that it's permitted to occupants?
Well, type C kind of gets around a whole bunch of these regulations. So, you can have more employees, you can.
Well, the definition of home occupation isn't changing in that it's carried on as an accessory use in a dwelling unit. So if it no longer is an accessory use and is a principal use and is not permitted in that zone, it would be a violation of the zoning ordinance, and we could enforce on that.
Okay.
So my follow-up to that question, though, is does it follow the owner of or residents of the house, or does it stay with the house? So 3 students move in, 3 students move out, another 3 students move in. Is the house still considered a type C?
It stays with the applicant, and it stays with the
Okay.
property.
Okay.
Once the use is discontinued, or the applicant is no longer residing at the property,
So if the applicant moves out and new applicants move in, they would have to reapply?
yes.
I mean, traditionally, if the use is identical, so let's say you have in a commercially zoned property a use that requires a conditional use permit, like car sales or something. If it changes hands from Joe to Bill, but they are running the same, they would still have to follow the same conditions that are in place. This is unique because it is a conditional use permit for an accessory use, which we don't often do. So we could give that some thought, and if it's necessary, provide some clarification in there. That's not something that we envision being an issue, but we can give that more thought.
I noticed that vehicle repair is singled out as a, for special treatment, and I really am a little concerned about that because some of the language in here says you can't have a car or a vehicle that's disabled. You can't have vehicles in a queue. No inoperable vehicles stored outside. If a automobile is in need of repair, it might be inoperable, at least for a time. I am quite a bit discouraged, or I have a lot of concerns about this. If there was such thing as that there was a time limit that an inoperable vehicle could be stored, I think that might be a workaround. It says only minor automobile repairs, and I think that is also pretty limiting. And
Well, the reason for minor automobile repairs is limited to that is because the building safety requirements for anything greater than that are more stringent than what you would find accommodated on a residential property. The other reason that we have restrictions for inoperable vehicles is not to create new regulation or code, it's to match existing code that we already have for where vehicles are parked or where they may be stored in that already exist in the zoning ordinance. If someone is doing home repair on their property, they're fixing their neighbor's car, if technically it's parked in their driveway, not operable, as long as it's parked and it's registered, it's not going to be standing out as inoperable. This is mainly designed at cars that might be jacked up on cinder blocks and sitting for several years in someone's backyard or on someone's driveway. That's mainly what that is aimed at. That sort of storage of vehicles or outside. So the language that's added for auto repairs isn't so much creating new regulation, it's just adding descriptive language to match what already exists within our building safety and zoning code.
Could you elaborate a little bit more about vehicle repair, what existing language and so forth is? Because I think as a home occupation, I've seen vehicle repair as kind of a pretty helpful thing, especially in a small neighborhood.
Well, absolutely. Vehicle
I have the
repair.
definition handy, if you'd like me to read the definition from the zoning ordinance of each of the minor and the major. Would that be helpful?
Sure.
Automobile repair major, general repair, rebuilding, or reconditioning of engines, motor vehicles or trailers, collision services, including body frame or fender straightening or repair, overall painting or paint shop, or vehicle steam cleaning. Whereas automobile repair minor is replacement of parts and motor services to passenger cars and trucks not exceeding 1.5 tons capacity, excluding body repairs. The idea, of course, is to keep things limited, not loud, not toxic, no fumes, that kind of thing.
And to accommodate major automobile repairs, if you're on a commercial property, would require, there are safety and environmental regulations that require accommodations on the facilities. So we wouldn't want to allow something, or it would be careful to allow something on residential that you might not even allow on commercial without the appropriate equipment or accommodations.
Would this be discouraging to somebody who's a hobbyist?
Well, they wouldn't be allowed to make any changes to their hobby cars that they advertise to the public, if they were running it as a business or a home occupation per se.
I'll go ahead.
appropriate for the chair to make motions, I know you.
I will move that we send Plan Case 2270T6, no, that's the wrong one. No, yeah, that's the right one. 2270T16 to the City Council with recommendation of approval.
Do we have a second? Discussion? Chris?
I am going to incur the wrath of my fellow commissioners, but I would propose an amendment that would strike the home occupation involved, let me see which section that is actually. On home occupation C, that's right. Home occupation C, subsection D, that would strike the home, that would strike the discriminatory home occupation involving vehicle repair, and see if that might be handled under other sorts of things that apparently already exist. I kind of have a think that I just wrestle with this thing about vehicle repairs.
Are you talking about the language in letter E?
D, yes. D.
D as in dog or E?
D is, well, on mine.
Is he
is in
referring
dog,
to the
But it's not a
revised
sub
version?
of C, it's actually D, it's a separate section.
Okay.
Let's make sure we're looking at the same thing, because in the revision, we
Oh,
did
you're right, it is
change some of the
E.
lettering
It is
in order to be.
It is now under E. Yeah, under paragraph E. Home occupation, geez. Yeah. E,
What?
yes.
I don't know if this is a point of order question,
Yeah.
just so I'm understanding this correctly. So the part about home occupation and vehicle repair isn't something that's new.
I'm looking at
So
the
it's
old-
not a text revision, which is what we're currently reviewing, right?
It is part of the existing code as it exists today.
So the text revision on that part is only the underlined, the only minor automobile
Oh, I see.
repairs. So
Yes,
I don't
you're
know if it's a
correct.
point of order.
We are not
Yeah.
suggesting any changes to that paragraph, but it
Right.
sounds as though
It
a
currently
commissioner
exists.
would like to see some changes to that paragraph.
Well,
Yeah.
it says that part of it's underlined.
What?
And
I don't think part of it is, only
The-
It
minor automotive
was a
repairs are defined in
clarification.
Article 2 are permitted in this, yeah. But, okay, and if we take the newly handed out version, it is E.
E, yes.
Right. And if I understand right, the clarifications here is to say, yes, you can have an automobile repair business in these conditions, but only minor repairs.
Yes, in the existing language, it said, no major automobile repairs defined as are permitted. We added as a home-based occupation, and then we said, only minors are allowed, which could already be inferred, but this just states it.
More clearly
Yeah.
states that. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
I see the clarification. I don't propose offering an amendment then.
okay, all right. So, we've got a motion. Any further discussion? Roll call.
Mr. Hopkins,
Yes.
Mr. Storr,
Yes.
Mr. Trail,
Yes.
Mr. Turner. Mr. Ackerson,
Yes.
Mr. Fell.
Okay, that passes. And
That's
that
also
will-
scheduled for February 1st, City Council.
Okay, new business, we have none. Audience participation, we have none. Staff report?
I have been asked to provide sort of a preview on what might be coming up in front of the commission in future meetings. So the things that we know about are the next meeting, we have scheduled a, what we're calling an omnibus rezoning. So much like how we did changes to the zoning ordinance, some cleanups there in a large text amendment. What we're suggesting here are some cleanups, some cleanup rezonings, all done in a large group. Simple things that over the years have been overlooked and hasn't been the use and won't ever be the use that it's currently zoned, that kind of thing, and to make some consistencies with the comprehensive plan. So that we have on tap for February 4th. And then the February 18th meeting likely will be consideration of a county zoning board of appeals text amendment. Right now, there is text being proposed and is going through their process to allow parking in their CR zone. In essence, it's to allow parking for non-county related activities to be allowed at the fairgrounds. So it's pretty specific. So we'll be looking at that in February. Tentatively scheduled is consideration of the bicycle plan, depending on how it proceeds through the other commissions. And then also the readoption of the zoning map for 2016. Future agendas will probably include the rezoning of the block north of, well, half of the block north of this very building, commonly called Block North or 200 South Vine, although the rezonings would be the residential portions on the eastern side of the block, so those would have an Urbana street address. Not sure when exactly that will come before you, but that's coming up too.
Okay. We have no study session, so we are adjourned.